So, Kate, thanks for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to having this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
So, maybe we can start by you telling us, how did you get involved in the world of DAOs and Web3 and crypto, and what has some of your work looked like in this space?
Yeah, so probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I started getting involved with a kind of an old bastion of decentralized organizing, which is kind of known around the world. It's called Enspiral. And it was at that time kind of a collective of entrepreneurs coming together to build human processes for organizing without hierarchy, for organizing in a way that was kind of in line with the world we wanted to see. And we were doing a whole bunch of things, running accelerator programs, building application. Lumio was a quite well known decentralized decision making application that came out of a team from Enspiral. And towards, a few years ago, I got really involved with one of the applications, which was called Co-Budget, which was around how do we collaboratively allocate shared resources using an application. And so we started to steward that application. And at the same time, it wasn't really the start of crypto. It was a bit later on. It was, 2017. We started to get involved with a group called DAOstack, who were building something somewhat similar on chain or on the blockchain, an application called Alchemy, which was about like how do we spend money as a DAO or as a decentralized autonomous organization? How do we spend our treasury so that it's not just a couple of people deciding which projects we fund, who gets to do the work? It was very much an experimentation, a big experiment in how do we use this wondrous technology of blockchain for all that it offers and start to spend money collaboratively. So we started a DAO as part of that, the Genesis DAO. This was this was a stage within what is known as Web3 of what I would call it was like the first wave of DAO obsession. We're in the second wave now, but that was the first wave, and that was after the big DAO hack. And it was just people who saw the opportunity that decentralized autonomous organizations could provide, and everyone was so excited. It was like, hey, we've got the solution. The solution is governance, actually. And I was like, what? But so from there, I took a bit of a break out of actively being involved, and I started writing some research papers around what is blockchain for good, and taking a bit of a step back and looking at the ecosystem. And I wrote a paper with Jared Clara Breck and Francesca Pick called the Dissensus Protocol, which is really looking at I won't talk too much about it now, but it's like this notion of the fork, which is very much a part of crypto and DAOs. Like the fork is when you basically create a new version of the protocol or the application, and you take the followers with you that want to use that new version. We were kind of looking at this phenomenon as like a fundamental protocol within DAOs and kind of critiquing that a bit. And finally, I've ended up at a wonderful protocol organization called Centrifuge, and Centrifuge bridges assets in the real world, like invoices, real estate, royalties from Spotify, although Spotify's a bit out right now, isn't it? A bit cancelled. But it bridges these kind of real assets, real collateral to DeFi, decentralized finance, so that borrowers can finance their real world assets without banks, basically, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, awesome. Maybe we can go back into some of those things that you mentioned a bit later in the conversation. But I think what you and I were really interested in talking about was kind of opening up some of these criticisms and critiques about some of these technologies and the ways that people are gathering and using them, and sort of examining, which critiques are valid, which are like unreasonable, how to discern the hype from the potential. So what are some of the main criticisms that you hear, and what are your thoughts on them? Let's maybe just like start throwing them in and talking about them together.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting, just the notion of the critiques, right? Because like right now there's a bit of a Twitter war happening around to critique or not critique, right? Like there's this like strong push from some of like the technology lords who say, if you can't build, shut up.
Mm.
Which is like, really? Is that like the only way we can kind of do things? Is like if you can't like build your own version, like with technology, then you don't get to criticize what we're doing. And I think that is like, it's a bit scary for me, because at the heart of the paper we wrote, the dissensus protocol, it's kind of like this notion of dissensus we're actually saying is fundamental for well-functioning societies. It's fundamental for democracy. Dissensus is a rupture. It's a break in consensus. And like without the ability to have dissensus, which is to have strong disagreement, which is like, critique is a part of that. If we don't have any room for dissensus, we don't actually have a free democratic society. It's allowing for the fact that incompatible positions do arise, they must arise. And through the kind of negotiation and transformation of thoughts and ideas and critiques, you can have a split or an exclusion, you can have a fork, or you can just build your own you can build your own version. You can take all your followers over there and you can do your own thing. But like, we want to not fork, I don't think, all the time. We want to stay here in the trouble, to quote Donna Haraway, and like see what going through these critiques and actually listening a little bit to the other side. And that goes for the people who are making the critiques as well. Like it's great to really think big, think philosophically, think politically, and look at the bigger picture and say, hey, this is extremely damaging. But if you expect the other side to listen, you've got to also listen. So this is what I'm really interested in talking about today, is like, how can we look at some of these critiques, look at the critique that's being made, and look at the other side.
Yeah, I'm super interested in that. It's also making me think about like there's been some backlash in the new ways of working movement, also like a couple of people who are speaking out against teal, for example, and saying there's no such thing as teal, or like teal is bullshit. And then people are often tagging me in conversations like, Lisa, what do you think of this? And I'm like, I'm all for it. Like, we can't just not have criticism of this stuff. Like, then we're just going to be in this, bell jar, and nothing's going to grow or develop or evolve. So I'm all for it.
Yeah. For the records, I think teal is a bit. Just kidding. Okay.
Yeah.
But shall we dive into some of these critiques?
Yeah.
And obviously, like, there's so much out there that this is just a bit of a selection and a few angles of looking at these critiques. But one of the main ones, like, that is bandied around all the time, and I have even used this word, is like Web3, DeFi, decentralized finance, is a mode of hyperfinancialization. And this is a really common critique to the environment. Obviously, it applies more broadly to crypto rather than just DAOs, but it's kind of saying, instead of the promise of ownership and democratized governance, which was, this is the sticker, we got pay to play. In order to participate in many of these communities and many of these DAOs, you either need tokens, you need to be a token holder, or you need to own an NFT, actually, sometimes. And the more valuable your NFT, the higher kind of standing you have in the community. The same goes for tokens. The more tokens you have, the more power you have. And so adding to this critique, which is getting really intense right now, the NFT thing, right? Like non-fungible tokens, which is basically an entry into a blockchain that represents ownership of something unique, which usually resides elsewhere, not on the blockchain. And so there's a very strong critique that this is just artificial scarcity, that the social status provided by ownership and the ability to trade them in secondary markets is really not, it's really opposed to this other vision that was possible for a moment of like the blockchain and crypto facilitating like this shared non-rivalrous place where we can solve a lot of like problems that we have in society with underfunding public goods. So yeah, basically this critique is saying that NFTs represent a triumph of value exchange capitalism, and markets, and any other ways of exchanging have lost. Basically, this is the ultimate triumph. And this takes place within a metaverse, which we'll get to. And so NFTs don't so much offer a technical innovation that will reroute like the mode of digital production, but they just give another very strong crutch to capitalism and free market theory, which, you know, is interesting. And some of the most, like the biggest, loudest critics of Web3, like Varoufakis and Morozov, have said NFTs have value only to the extent that bragging rights offer utility to those who care for them. Like, that's it. It's bragging rights. And in doing so, they've forced like institutional art system, like institutions like Sotheby's, Christie's, used to monopolize the bragging rights to play their game, right? So the critique here is that NFTs in no way subvert the structure of property rights in a meaningful way. But on the other side, and like, yeah, jump in whenever you want here, like I'm in this space, and like in the space, it's kind of like, you know, like we deserve to be paid, especially artists that like, and our friends Richard Bartlett and Stephen made an argument. I don't remember which podcast it was on, but the other day, that these artists that are benefiting from the NFT craze absolutely deserve the right to be paid, and paid well for their work.
Yeah, and some people, you know, there's stories of people being like lifted out of poverty, or, you know, like life-changing money, right? And I was saying, you know, our chat thread as well, that I was listening to one of the episodes of the On the Other Side podcast, and they were talking about this criticism in the language of like mercenaries versus missionaries, and that there's this sort of criticism of like, oh, well, you know, people are just in it for the money, though, like that's not very noble or something. And it's like, okay, but people deserve to be paid for their work, and we're not criticizing traditional organizations in the same way. So there's like a lot of pressure on new models to be like completely utopian and noble, and I'm not saying there aren't like problematic areas, and we're going to go into, you know, those in this conversation, but it is interesting to me, this very high standards that we're putting on people. And I think there is an opportunity, as you said, to kind of bring more money into the places where money has previously been scarce for kind of activists and people.
Activists, artists, I mean, they contribute an infinite amount of value to our daily life. And it's, I think that what you said, like there's always been a narrative that it's noble to be a poor struggling artist, but like in the world we live in right now, it's hard to make that judgment and say, okay, this is how it's always been, you better stay there. And it makes being an artist or being an activist sometimes into a very privileged occupation, and we can't afford for that to be privileged as a society. And I think one thing we were talking about the other day is there's also this strong sentiment that the millennial generation, our generation, and I think it's Gen Z, younger, have got a raw bloody deal when it comes to the economy, right? Like in this idea of upward mobility.
Mm.
It's where I'm from in New Zealand, you absolutely need to have wealthy parents in order to buy a house. And like being a renter is really not a viable option because we have terrible tenancy laws. So have rich parents? Nope. Do you want to be a surgeon or a banker? No, for various reasons. Some being capacity problems. But like millennials and Gen Zeros have created this fantastical development of a totally new economy, and it's huge. You know, it's like a serious. I mean, threats maybe not the right word, but it's a serious alternative to the kind of economy that we've grown up with, and many people have escaped the trap of a 9 to 5
Mm.
existence and scraping by or just being okay with this idea that like in order to live you need to sell your time at the going rate of someone else that decides. So it's pretty interesting to look at it from that angle. And I will get into some of the ways that it can be quite accessible as well.
Mm. Yeah, I'm interested to hear about that and to hear about like some of the kinds of people that you've interacted with and that you kind of encounter in these spaces.
Yeah, for sure. I think like there is a big critique that Web3 and the people who are in DAOs it's not very diverse. You know, it's a lot of the same people that build Web2, which is of course, you know, the internet that we know and maybe don't love, owned by big 5 tech companies, and the people that develop that usually are, you know, is of a similar type. And I think that that's true sometimes, but like in my experience, I'm working with people that I would never have had the opportunity to work with, and like they're benefiting hopefully a lot. I mean, in one of the DAO squads that I'm in, we have people from India, from Turkey, Ukraine, Mexico, Guatemala. We have a guy whose main job is in a fruit store, and he starts work at 4 a.m. and is like after hours he's like making this transition to working full time in DAOs. And with that, he's going to be able to spend way more time with his daughter. And I think that that's super cool, right? Like I would never have been able to. And it's really funny. Like I'm working with, you know, this guy from the Ukraine who I've never seen his face, and this is something super interesting about DAOs, right? There's this big focus on the autonomous part, in which is actually people in DAOs often interpret that as anonymity or pseudonymity, not showing your real identity. And it can make DAOs, especially large ones, feel like strange apocalyptic versions of the future. You're actually in a meeting with 30 people, and so most of them have like their names, which are like fatty asses, doggy poops, hacker 765, mutant hand 7, and you're like, what? So they're trying not to dox themselves or let their real identity out. And you might be working with some of these people for 6 months and never see their real face, and then you figure out, you know, they can one other person I'm working with is from somewhere deep in Russia, and we don't have like we can't really just get on a call and talk fluently, but we're communicating through just very good vibes, like sharing memes, like jokes. So I think that this is really interesting. It's yeah, we're just in this squad doing work, solving problems, having a really good time. For me, with people that I would never have had the chance to work with and who are really benefiting from access, because in places like, you know, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, things are like in terms of their access to finances is extremely precarious. So, yeah.
It's super interesting. And I don't know if this is like a good road into one of the other critiques that we've talked about, you and I, before. You know, when people say, well, it doesn't feel very human, all of this stuff, you know,
Yeah.
and, you know, and I'm guilty of this critique also because I'm not in any DAOs, and it's sort of really challenging. It's interesting. I'm sort of holding this tension of like, like how can you build trust with people when you haven't seen their face, when you haven't spent time with them, maybe when you've never spoken, even heard their voice, right? Like that to me is super fascinating. Like, how do you make decisions together? How do you build trust? How do you collaborate when all of those norms of how we normally build trust are sort of out the window in some ways?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a critique that comes from the world of, self-management or new ways of working, and where we do put a lot of emphasis on trust and relationships and connection and culture. And, there's a large kind of thrust of blockchain, which is to remove the need for trust. It's like you don't need to trust each other because we have a technological fix that means that it doesn't exist. And I think that doesn't need to exist. I think that was very much the thinking in about 2016, 2017, that finally, like, the human problems that make everything so hard, we would have to deal with them so much. And I think within Web3, that mindset has really shifted. Even Vitalik, the founder of Ethereum, has said, like, I was a bit naive about that. And I think that, we'll always have to work with people. So I think people have really come around to that. But I mean, at the same time, we are working within these very remote, kind of strange, anonymous contexts. And this is where the idea of, like, there's too much metaverse, like we are destroying the fabric of human relations, because we're spending all our time on the computer in a digital realm. I mean, the metaverse doesn't quite exist yet, but like, I'll just pause 1 second. So yeah, I think a lot of this judgment, or the critique is, this is too removed, it's too inhuman, it's too digital. We're going off into this world where weakened social relations are bringing on a very big host of problems, from loneliness to depression to a break in the social fabric of community that enable us to, like, solve problems together and get through the big disasters and attempts on liberal democracy that are surely on our doorstep. Well, it's kind of scary. On the other hand, like, there is actually a lot of community being built in DAOs, and like, it is hard when you don't see someone's face and you don't know their real name and you've never met them. But I think I really experienced a lot of trust still being built, and like, humans can communicate in many other ways and through many mediums. So I think there's still a lot of hope there. It's very different to what many of the decentralized communities that we were involved with in the past kind of prioritize. Like in Enspiral, the big priority is a connection to each other, and in a face-to-face way, in a human way. And this is, it's almost rooted in Te Ao Maori, which is has a strong kind of grounding and acknowledging the ancestors and the whakapapa and the land in Aotearoa. And this, compared with the metaverse, is just like a completely different story. But yeah, I think that there is still a lot of connection happening with people from all around the globe that would never have met, and this holds really a lot of potential.
Yeah, it's super interesting because, like, I've been, listening to podcasts about Web3, and it does seem like there are people coming from like the community building space now and sort of applying some principles there. And one obvious thing is like that people in DAOs will have gatherings in the future, maybe, but then that's always going to exclude people who want to remain anonymous, or for whom travel is not possible, or things like that. So it is interesting to me, like how do you what are the ways then that you build trust, or maybe that's the wrong question, right? Because you're saying that maybe trust is assumed and it's more about I don't know, creating vibes or whatever
Yeah,
the jargon is.
that's definitely the jargon. But also, DAOs do meet up. I mean, there's crypto conferences all around the world that, what basically happens, and there are many different types of DAOs. There are protocol or platform DAOs where there's, a protocol that's usually started out as built by a team, like an organization, and they're building the protocol. And then what happens over time is they progressively decentralize this so that everyone that uses this protocol has the token, the network token or the governance token that they use as a community to decide, okay, which integration are we going to use? How much should the treasury spend on X proposal? Blah blah blah. So it's that's kind of a platform or a protocol DAO, but there's also a creator DAO. So it's like, hey, we're all creating a certain type of NFT, and we're gonna do something with the proceeds together, and like that's our DAO. There's service DAOs, like friends of mine have it's kind of a web developers DAO called DORG, and they're basically like a freelancers collective, except they build the technology for other projects in the space, and they're paid in crypto, and they have they operate, I don't know which DAO technology they use, but it's basically like porting a freelancers collective on chain. And you have other type investment DAOs where the group basically decides what they're going to invest in, and then social DAOs, which are like communities. Friends with Benefits, a famous one. So there's all these different types of DAOs, and they're basically all of the big kind of protocols or the famous crypto names have a DAO beside them or around them, and they're meeting up at these conferences, right? So, and they're even starting to do like I know that in Lisbon last year, Fran and Eleanor from Greater Than did like an offsite with the DX DAO to help them to work on some of their challenges, which were, the challenges that all organizations face about like who's doing what, who's taking leadership, who's burning out, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so this makes me think about another thing that we started talking about was like governance and decision making. And my understanding from you was that when you make kind of decisions about things, there are slightly reduced options compared to like people who are maybe used to like consent-based decisions or integrative decision making or generative decision making. Can you say something about like how that process works and the kind of advantages or disadvantages of how that's typically done in DAOs?
Yeah, so the kind of baseline decision making type is consensus. And that obviously doesn't mean 100% consensus. It means usually 51% majority. And I think that is totally apt for very large groups, because like doing a consent-based decision or a generative decision-making process with a very large group who are distributed all around the world, who sometimes have anonymous members, is really hard. So decision fatigue is a thing we see all the time in society. Even like people don't want to show up to vote every 3 or 4 years. And a lot of these DAOs, they do run on the idea that token holders, i.e. community members, will be voting all the time. And of course, people don't want to. Like, it's really interesting that a lot of the energy for DAOs came from this thinking about governance minimization. And actually, we did the opposite, and we built governance maximization, where like people need to be really involved in very long discussions and voting all the time and paying to vote. And so, but now what I'm seeing in different governance models, like the polka dot governance model, is actually you have a council of anywhere between 7 to 50 members who are meant to represent those kind of unengaged or disengaged people within the DAO, and they're kind of thinking always, what is best for the DAO, and this is very equivalent to having councillors or politicians in normal life. So it's like we're going back to some first principles. But yeah, I guess the idea that the DAO or a DAO is very suitable when it's a large group of people and they're doing something related to crypto or blockchain. Like it's apt entirely, and you still can use consent-based approaches in smaller groups. Like I think that there's definitely nothing wrong with having small teams or small squads that exist within DAOs and that use different decision-making types and who are not making all of their decisions on chain. I think that that's really not a good use of time or energy. So that's how we do it at Centrifuge, which there is a team called K Factory who are basically 40 people, developers, engineers, marketing, community builders who are building the protocol, and we are a self-managing organization. So we're using in our teams consent-based decisions, advice process. We have, the whole gamut of roles and responsibilities, and like continual feedback and circles with kind of facilitative leaders. And then we have the DAO, which is, the community members, people who have invested, and together the team and the community are making decisions about what's best for the protocol. And that happens on chain, on substrate, what it's called.
So another thing that I'm really interested to talk about with you is that we originated in the same kind of space of self-managing organizations and new ways of working and that whole kind of movement. And having kind of watched you and some of our other colleagues like start to venture into the world of DAOs and Web3 and so on, it sort of seems to me as an outsider that there's a bit of a gap or like a canyon between these worlds, almost, that they're not talking to each other so much or sharing learnings. Like I feel like each one could benefit the other probably in different ways, or could learn from pitfalls that the other kind of falls into. What's your sense of that? And I don't know if I'm being overly reductive and splitting into two things, but having been in both kind of spaces, what's your sense?
Have a lot in common, but there is a gap there, and I want to address that. But I think if we're going to talk about DAOs, then, and we've talked a bit about the reason they have emerged as they're an organizing system, right? Inextricably linked to the world of crypto and Web3. And they came about because a bit as like this very strong reaction to the breakdown that happened after the global financial crisis, and also particularly Web 2, the ownership and the monopolization by big tech, by the big five. And at the start of Web 2, everyone could create their own content, and they could really participate in this new kind of internet, this new web. And there's a great book by Clay Shirky called Here Comes Everybody, which was just like so. It was this book so celebrating the fact that now finally we had this internet where everyone can be part of it and bring their gifts and participate, and that like pretty much got destroyed. And so now we have this new Web 3, which will actually democratize ownership, and that is built in to the technology. So this brings me back to the question, which is that there's actually this third world that I want to bring in here, that DAOs have more overlap with the sector that's often left out of the thinking when it comes to new ways of working, because A, it's not new, and B, because it prioritizes redistribution
Mm-hmm.
rather than just recognition. And this, of course, cooperatives.
Mm.
To me, sometimes self-managing organizations that merely give recognition, and what I mean by this is like limited decision making and a very nice communicative culture where everyone can like bring their whole selves to work. This is great, but I think it misses the key lever of redistribution. And so if you have recognition without redistribution, and I'm quoting the theorist Nancy Fraser here, you're not really making things a whole lot better for people. It's kind of window dressing. It's a bit superficial.
It's like asking people to act like owners when they don't own anything.
Yeah, and take all the burden, the responsibility, the late nights, the stress, the burnout that comes with that.
Mm.
Yeah. So yeah, cooperatives, on the other hand, like are not quite many that I've seen. Like they have this foundational kind of commitment to redistribution, but they're also, apart from like a vote every year on like who's going to become um, the board, I guess, or who's going to be leading, they don't have so much of an opportunity to give recognition on top of redistribution. So they're doing the other side of the parcel. And I really think like DAOs have the opportunity to be the middle ground here between like the amazing work that cooperatives have done for the last century in fighting for redistribution and the work that self-managing organizations have done in bringing about a really good recognition of people's inherent capacity to be curious, to solve problems, to make decisions without like permission, without being parented by someone who's in the hierarchy above them. So yeah, I think there's a great potential for all three of these things to like meld together to learn. And I think there has been a bit of a gap, but I do see it happening a lot. Like Nathan Schneider, who's a big voice in the co-op world, has been doing a lot of work trying to bridge this gap. There's organizations like Centrifuge who are, operating like they have a DAO and they're becoming a self-managing organization. There's lots of teams out there who are like learning, especially from the Web3 space, actually. So I think it's like, hey, when it comes to self-managing organizations, and are they learning? Are they looking over and saying, oh, hey, what's happening here with this swarm of activity and this craziness?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I've just finished reading Matt Perez, his book, Radical Companies, and he was talking about co-management instead of self-management and co-ownership, and saying that I think to use your example of those three spaces, I think like self-managing companies generally are working on the idea of co-management, like that we make decisions together, that we we have a say and stuff, but not co-ownership often. And then cooperatives, have been working on the co-ownership thing obviously for a long time, but don't always have the co-management piece in place. They don't have governance, so people don't really have a say. They might have a kind of a sort of symbolic vote, but they still maybe don't have a say in big things like does the company get sold, or things like that. And then DAOs are kind of in this other space, maybe also looking at co-ownership, and starting now to maybe also look at co-management. So it's sort of interesting to think about these three things, and how I'm really interested in how we can like share learnings between the three, and sort of like.
Absolutely. And I think that, I mean, there's a very common critique that within DAOs, the way that this co-ownership, co-management happens needs improvement, because governance tokens, governance power, and like how you can shape the direction of the DAO can be bought, not earned. And so there are a few interesting experiments around how to shift that. People trying to do kind of reputation systems, tokens, or like giving more power to people based on like how they they perform or how they are in the DAO, or how good at decision making they are actually, which is interesting. But yeah, I do agree that like there's these three worlds with so much in common. How can we get more learning and sharing and copying and stealing happening? It's a really important question.
Yeah. Well, we're sort of like coming to the end of our conversation. What do you really want listeners to know? Like, I guess the audience of this podcast tends to be people who are in the self-managing organization space, or, you know, interested in new ways of working. I'm guessing there's probably going to be a few people in the Web3 space listening because of the subject, but is there something that we haven't talked about yet that you really want people to know or hear? Or
Yeah, I guess like maybe people will turn off once I start talking, because I really want to just end with like a bit of a passion of mine, which is this idea of governance theory, which it's become like a word even in self-managing organizations, and definitely in Web3 and DAOs, that has, I think the usage must have gone up, 500% in the last 10, 20 years. And like I did my master's thesis in governance theory. And so I'm just really interested in how people are understanding what governance means. And I would love to just spend a bit of time chatting about that, because we just touched on the fact that in DAOs, it's all about governance. It's become like this. We've seen this kind of blowback effect of governance maximization, where the intention was to reduce bureaucracy, and now people are learning a lot about that. But I think governance itself has actually had a really interesting evolution since it started to be used, which is actually being played out in a very quick timescale within DAOs. So initially, governance was the process of deciding which rules and regulations will be enacted by a sanctioned authority in a top-down manner, right? The state, usually the state to the people. And this is really interesting, because this actually, I think, resembles early governance ideas in Bitcoin, which is like, hey, there's this sanctioned body. It's maybe decentralized, but it's still like being sanctioned by the consensus mechanism. And now we would refer to this as Bitcoin maximalism, where, so the absolute sovereignty of the state is replaced by the absolute sovereignty of a neutral technical architecture of consensus algorithms and code. So this is going to make Bitcoiners hunt me down. Too bad I hardly ever check Twitter, but I'm actually saying that the governance within Bitcoin is actually quite close to the first evolution of governance as we know it in society, which is top-down regulation, state to people. And then we have a second evolution of governance theory first and then practice later in the 1970s, which actually emerged as a critique. Yay for critiques. It does, they do stuff. But like it was a critique of like steering actions by political authorities that would then shape socioeconomic process and structure, or social life. And so the second evolution is markets influencing and directing social and political life. And this is like this also resembles the second stage in crypto governance ideologies, following like quite a few forks, and especially the Ethereum protocols. So rather than solely a consensus protocol, it became what we call like a design space, where like all these different experimental fields of crypto economics, token design, mechanism design, and more, in contrast to this older, more hierarchical top-down structure of Bitcoin maximalism governance. So that was kind of like, markets influence governance was what happened in the 1970s, and that's kind of what we saw in the kind of second evolution of crypto governance as well. And I mean, that still exists, absolutely. But I do think that there's a third evolution of governance theory that happened in normal world, let's call it, and that's looking at the horizontal self-organizing aspects of networks, especially networks where they were gaining increasing prominence in the wake of many government and market failures. So we had this third way, this third like approach of governance. And here we think about governance as horizontal, reciprocative modes of coordination where people participate in networks or groups, and they decide about what to do and how to do it. And so I think that that's really where we're at with a lot of DAOs right now. It's like, okay, the first evolution, yeah, that's very relevant to a particular type of DAO. I don't even think you can call Bitcoin a DAO, actually, a type of token or crypto. And then you have the second, which is, like the market-based governance will solve everything. And that's still very dominant, actually. But there is this third way saying, hey, like there's this a way that we can like integrate the more horizontal self-organizing aspects of networks as well as using like the market-based governance. So yeah, I guess it's just a super interesting area. I think the use of the word governance has become like overused to the point where it's like, oof, do we just mean a decision we're making about which toothpaste to buy, or are we actually talking about governance? But yeah, I think this is an area that there could be a lot more thinking done in.
Yeah, that's super interesting. What's your, like, in kind of concluding our conversation, like what's your hope for this space? Like what are you excited about? What do you hope will happen?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm really hopeful that there's this like the sliver of a dream that started this whole thing in some ways, that we can have this world where people actually have ability to govern in a much more meaningful way than what we're currently experiencing, that they have the ability to have ownership of the things that they build, and especially technology, that you're not the product anymore. And that with this, like we unlock a whole new possibility to coordinate and address kind of big societal problems. Like we grow our coordination muscle in a way that we haven't been able to do before, because now we have the aid of this, in many ways, brilliant technology, which actually there is no escaping the fact that you need to learn how to coordinate, and you need to engage, and you need to really be there and participate in order to shape where we're going. So my hope is that that sliver continues to grow, because on the other side we have the majority of Web3 and crypto, which is, I don't know if it's majority, but it's a big part that is very much there for speculation, for like seeing the world in a very zero-sum way, betting on the fact that it's going to get even tougher than it is now, and that to forge another currency that lives outside the remit and the power of states and governments and corporations is the only way, or the economy as we know it is the only way that they're going to retain power. And so that lineage and that like direction, I think, is really scary. And I just hope like all the people, and there are many of them that are, in Web3, like looking at the potential, continuing to bring in like lessons that have been hard won and hard learned from movements like the anti-globalization movement in the late 2000s, and lessons from self-managing organizations, lessons from activist movements, and indigenous people who have been challenging the status quo and powers that be for many years. I hope that this kind of this group and grows, and that we are able to like do something with this idealistic sliver of hope, you know. So that's my big hope.
Yeah, that's awesome. I subscribe.
Okay, come into the squad.
Yeah.